Imagine this. It is your wedding night in a cold stone chamber, surrounded not just by your new husband, but by watchful relatives, servants, even priests. Candles flicker, the air is heavy, and all eyes are waiting for one thing: proof. Proof that you are untouched. Proof that your body has never belonged to another man. And if the evidence is not there, the blood-stained sheet is missing. If your body does not perform as expected, then your life, your family's honor, and sometimes even your very survival could crumble in a single night. This was the terrifying reality of medieval marriage. A union that we often imagine as romantic, filled with chivalry, feasts, and noble vows, was in truth something far darker. Marriage in the Middle Ages was less about love and more about contracts, property, and power. And at the heart of it all lay one fragile, brutal expectation: the virginity of the bride. Virginity was not just a private matter, it was public currency. It determined whether a family could form alliances, whether dowries were paid, and whether entire dynasties thrived or fell into ruin. For noble families, a daughter's body was not her it was a bargaining chip, traded to secure influence and wealth. For peasants, the stakes were different, but no less severe. Even among the poor, a girl's purity was a marker of her worth and her family's honor. But what happens when society demands proof? That is where the horror begins. Across medieval Europe, cultures devised cruel and humiliating ways to test the chastity of women. Some were private rituals performed in the bridal chamber, while others turned into public spectacles. Sheets were checked, bodies were inspected, and in some cases, entire communities judged a woman based on the most intimate, invasive details of her life. And let's be clear, this was not just embarrassing. Failing a virginity test could destroy a woman's future. It could mean annulment, public shaming, banishment, torture, or even death. Imagine the terror of being judged not for who you were, but for what your body revealed or didn't reveal on command. In this video, we are diving deep into the horrific truth about medieval marriage and virginity tests. We'll uncover how these practices shape society, the shocking rituals used to prove purity, the punishments for women who failed, and the scandals that rocked courts and kingdoms when the blood-stained sheets soar. The lack of them sparked chaos. But before we begin this journey into one of the darkest and most humiliating aspects of the Middle Ages, make sure to subscribe to Past of Medieval. By doing so, you'll never miss our explorations into the strange, brutal, and haunting truths of history. And if you're ready, let's step into the shadows of the medieval wedding chamber, where purity meant power, and a single night could decide a woman's fate forever. In the medieval imagination, a woman's virginity was not simply a private matruit, was a commodity, a symbol of family honor, and, disturbingly, something that could be publicly judged and even tested. Marriages in the Middle Ages were rarely about love. They were about alliances, power, and wealth. But at the heart of those alliances, society placed one question above all others: was the bride truly a virgin? Now, you might think this would be a personal matter, left between two people on their wedding night. But medieval culture turned it into something far more invasive, even humiliating. For noble families, especially, a daughter's virginity could determine whether an alliance succeeded or collapsed. And that meant it wasn't enough to simply claim chastity. It had to be proven. The church itself played a central role in this obsession. Virginity was seen as not only physically pure, but spiritually holy. Clerics praised virgins as being closer to angels than to ordinary humans. So when a young woman entered marriage, the expectation was that her purity would be intact. The pressure was immense. Failing to meet that expectation could mean disgrace, annulment, or even being cast out entirely. One of the most shocking practices was the so-called virginity tests. These tests ranged from crude physical inspections to bizarre rituals that now sound like something out of a nightmare. In some cases, older women, midwives, or even church officials were tasked with examining the bride to see if she was still intact. Imagine the terror of standing before strangers, your entire future hinging on whether their judgment deemed you pure enough. And it wasn't only the women who were put through this humiliation. Families and communities often got involved in the outcome of the wedding night. Yes, you heard that right, some cultures required proof of consummation, sometimes in the form of blood-stained sheets displayed publicly after the first night of marriage. If the sheets weren't marked, whispers of dishonor spread quickly, and the young bride's reputation could be destroyed forever. But what if there was no blood? After all, biology doesn't always follow cultural myths. Not every woman bleeds on her first sexual encounter. Some may have lost their hymen through innocent activities like horseback riding or manual labor, both common in medieval life. Yet this didn't matter to a society built on superstition. Lack of blood meant suspicion, and suspicion meant shame. Many desperate women resorted to tricks, like smearing blood from an animal onto the sheets to fake the evidence. The consequences of failing these so-called tests were brutal. In some regions, a failed virginity test could lead to the marriage being annulled on the spot. In others, it could lead to violent punishment, even death, for the young bride who was deemed impure. For noble women, the stakes were even higher, since their marriage often determined political alliances. Entire treaties could crumble if a bride failed to prove her chastity. This wasn't just about women's bodies, it was about control. The obsession with virginity was a way for men, the church, and society at large to police female sexuality, ensuring that women's value was tied not to their character, skills, or intellect, but to whether their bodies met an arbitrary standard. And while all of this sounds horrifying enough, there's an even darker side. In many cases, these virginity tests became spectacles of humiliation, carried out not privately, but in ways designed to reinforce public shame. Imagine how terrifying it must have been to know that your body, your future, and even your family's honor could be decided in such a cruel and degrading way. If the virginity tests before marriage were cruel, the aftermath on the wedding night could be even more disturbing. In many regions of medieval Europe, the consummation of marriage wasn't just a private affair, it was a public matter, tied directly to the honor of both families. For noble families especially, the consummation was proof that the union was valid, binding, and fertile. Without it, a marriage could be declared void. This is why the so-called wedding night rituals became a matter of almost theatrical performance. Some traditions demanded that the bride and groom consummate their marriage while witnesses waited outside the chamber, sometimes even cheering or praying for success. Imagine the pressure of knowing your intimacy was being treated as a public event, with your family's reputation hanging in the balance. But the most shocking of all was the expectation of proof, specifically blood-stained sheets. The morning after the wedding night, sheets were displayed to relatives or even to the entire household as evidence that the bride had been a virgin. These sheets became a grim kind of receipt, proof that the alliance was valid and that honor was preserved. Without this evidence, rumors could spread like wildfire, and the consequences could be devastating. Of course, this system was built on a myth that all women bled upon losing their virginity. As we now know, that isn't true. But in a world obsessed with symbolic proof, biology didn't matter, belief did. And so, women who didn't bleed often resorted to desperate measures. Some would scratch themselves to produce blood. Others would smuggle small amounts of animal blood into the chamber. The fact that such tricks were even necessary shows just how terrifying the stakes really were. And then there's the darker side of enforcement. If a woman was accused of not being a virgin, her entire future could collapse in an instant. Husbands could claim they had been deceived, families could lose political standing, and in some cases, women were cast aside or subjected to humiliating punishments. A woman branded as impure was often seen as damaged goods, unsuitable for marriage. But the cruelty didn't stop there. Some regions and courts even brought disputes over virginity to trial. Imagine standing before judges or priests, forced to defend your purity, as though it were a crime. In these cases, testimony, gossip, and invasive examinations all came into play. The bride's voice was almost always silenced, while the weight of judgment came down based on superstition and hearsay. One infamous case comes from medieval France, where a young noblewoman's marriage was annulled, after her husband claimed she hadn't been a virgin. Despite her protests and her family's outrage, the court sided with the husband, and she was sent back to her father's home in disgrace. Her name became a stain on her family, even though no real evidence existed beyond the absence of blood. These practices highlight something chilling. Marriage in the Middle Ages was on about love or partnership. It was about power, control, and the policing of women's bodies. Virginity became a weapon, a tool to bind women to a system where their worth was determined by forces beyond their control. And yet, there's also a layer of hypocrisy here. While women were held to impossible standards of chastity, men were often free to indulge in premarital sex, mistresses, or even outright debauchery without the same level of scrutiny. Society turned a blind eye to male desire while condemning women for the smallest perceived transgression. So when we talk about the horrors of medieval marriage, we not just talking about strange traditions or old superstitions, we talking about a system built on double standards, cruelty, and humiliation. The church's role in medieval marriage and virginity tests cannot be overstated. If families enforced the rituals at home, the church gave them the sacred authority and legitimacy to do so. By the 12th century, marriage had been declared one of the official sacraments of the Catholic Church, which meant that priests and bishops now had the final say in whether a marriage was valid or not. And with that power came a strict obsession with purity, chastity, and the dreaded question of virginity. Priests often lectured brides on the importance of keeping themselves unspoiled before marriage, framing their virginity as a holy gift that bound not just man and woman, but man, woman, and God. The body of the bride was no longer her onet, was property of her family, her husband, and, in a symbolic way, the church itself. Virginity was preached as a sacred treasure, a marker of holiness. But the moment it became entangled with politics and property, it turned into something far more dangerous. A contract that women could not escape. Trials of virginity were among the most humiliating spectacles sanctioned by the church. In some recorded cases, bishops and priests themselves appointed physicians or worse, midwives with no real medical knowledge to perform physical examinations on accused women, the aim to determine whether the hymen was still intact. Today, we know such examinations are unscientific and deeply harmful. But in the medieval mindset, they carried divine weight. A woman's body was inspected like livestock. Her fate decided not by her character, but by anatomy misinterpreted through superstition. Consider the chilling story of Joan of Leeds, a 14th century English nun, who faked her own death to escape convent life. Although hers was a rebellion against celibacy vows rather than marriage. The way the church responded to her impurity illustrates the obsession with female sexual control. Joan's body, her virginity, her chastity, was considered property of the church. By escaping and living as a woman outside its control, she was condemned in official documents as seduced by the devil and accused of corrupting her body. This example, though slightly different, mirrors exactly how brides were viewed. Their sexual status was never their own to decide. And in the noble courts of Europe, disputes over virginity sometimes escalated into highly publicized trials. One notorious case in 15th century France involved a young noblewoman whose marriage was annulled because her husband claimed she wasn't a virgin. When the woman's family protested demanding justice, the court called upon so-called experts to examine her body. The verdict: impure. Her marriage dissolved, her reputation destroyed. The case wasn't just humiliating, it was political theater, with the church playing arbiter of what was essentially a family power struggle. But not all women went quietly into this system. Some learned to resist in subtle ways. We know from surviving texts that women sometimes used herbal concoctions or folk remedies to simulate bleeding on the wedding night. Others bribed servants to tamper with sheets or help conceal evidence of supposed virginity. These small acts of defiance revealed the cracks in the system. Women understood its cruelty, and some fought back in whatever ways they could, even when the odds were stacked against them. Still, the reality was harsh. For every woman who found a way to navigate these impossible standards, countless others were crushed under the weight of shame, suspicion, and control. Families could be ruined, alliances shattered, and lives destroyed, all hinging on a single, intimate expectation. And here's the most haunting part. The church not only sanctioned these practices, but also spiritualized them. Virginity wasn't just about social honor, it was framed as divine law, which meant that resisting or failing the test wasn't just a social crime, but a sin against God himself. This blending of religion, politics, and personal intimacy created a nightmare system where the most private aspects of a woman's life became public property. Marriage was supposed to be sacred, but in reality, it became a cage one built from superstition, hypocrisy, and fear. If we peel back the layers of medieval marriage customs, we find not only ritual and superstition, but also scandal-reel stories of lives ruined, reputations destroyed, and punishments so extreme that they seem almost unreal. One of the most infamous scandals comes from 14th century Spain, where a noble woman named Blanca was publicly humiliated after her husband, claimed she was not a virgin on their wedding night. Whether this was true or not didn't matter. The accusation alone was enough to put her life in jeopardy. In front of the court, witnesses were called, physicians examined her, and rumors spread like wildfire. In the end, her marriage was annulled, and Blanca was forced into a convent to live out her days in shame. Here we see how the virginity test was indeed just about honor. It was a weapon of political convenience, used by husbands to escape alliances they no longer wanted. Another scandal that rocked England involved Margaret of Anjou, the wife of King Henry VI. Rumors swirled that she was unfaithful, with whispers that her son might not even be the king's child. Though never proven, these accusations carried enormous weight in a world where a queen's virginity and fidelity were essential to dynastic stability. Margaret was vilified in chronicles. Even centuries later, her reputation remained poisoned by slander. This illustrates how virginity and chastity were not just personal but political. One accusation could destabilize an entire kingdom. The mythology surrounding virginity itself also played a role in these horrors. In medieval medical texts, writers like the infamous Albertus Magnus described bizarre theories that virgin women had colder bodies, tighter flesh, or even a special seal that made them physically distinct. None of this had any basis in reality, but these pseudoscientific ideas were treated as gospel. Husbands and priests clung to them, and women were judged accordingly. The absurdity of it all is staggering, but in its time, these beliefs carried the power of life and death. Consider, too, the case of Agnes Bernauer in 15th century Bavaria. Though not born noble, she married Duke Albrecht's son in secret. When their union was discovered, Agnes was accused of witchcraft. Her seduction of a prince framed as an unnatural corruption, but at the root of this accusation was a familiar obsession. Agnes was seen as unworthy because she did not fit the image of a pure noble bride. Her marriage was declared invalid, and the punishment, she was drowned in the Danube River, executed not for any crime, but for failing to embody the impossible ideals of medieval purity. And the punishments for women who failed virginity expectations were indeed always confined to the nobility. Among peasants, village courts, and local lords enforced brutal customs. Women who were accused of dishonor could be flogged, paraded half-naked, or forced to wear degrading symbols in public. In some towns, brides who were suspected of lying about their virginity were displayed with shaved heads, mocked by the crowd, and abandoned by their families. For these women, the system wasn't abstract, it was raw, physical violence inflicted on their bodies and reputations. But the cruelty did not end with the women themselves. Men who married impure women could also be stigmatized, branded as cuckolds or weak husbands. The obsession with virginity corrupted entire communities, creating a culture of fear where intimacy became a public spectacle and marriage a battlefield of suspicion. What emerges from these stories is a chilling truth. Medieval marriage was less about love or companionship, and more about control over women's bodies, control over family alliances, and control over the stability of kingdoms. The virginity test was never really about morality. It was about power, and this obsession, this fixation on purity, would only grow darker as the centuries went on, twisting marriage into a stage for humiliation, scandal, and blood. Marriage in the Middle Ages was rarely private. Instead, it was a stage where every detail could become a public matter. And nowhere was this more visible than in the strange rituals that surrounded the wedding night. One of the most unsettling customs was the public display of the proof of virginity. In many parts of Europe, families expected to see blood-stained sheets after the wedding night as evidence that the bride was pure. If the sheets were shown without blood, it was grounds for scandal, annulment, and disgrace. Imagine the pressure, an intimate act reduced to physical evidence, scrutinized not just by the couple, but by in-laws, neighbors, and sometimes even the entire community. In some households, the stained sheets were even paraded in public, a grotesque celebration of honor that blurred the line between sacred union and crude spectacle. But what if there was no blood? This was a terrifying possibility, because not every woman bleeds during her first sexual experience. Medieval people didn't know that, so they invented explanations accusing women of fornication, witchcraft, or unnatural acts. Some desperate brides turned to deception. Folk remedies and secret tricks were passed down. Pricking a finger with a needle, slaughtering a small animal in secret to stain the sheets, or even smuggling in vials of animal blood. For many, survival depended on crafting the illusion of purity. The rituals didn't stop at the sheets. In noble households, the consummation of marriage could be treated as a semi-public ceremony. Servants, witnesses, or priests sometimes stood nearby, not to participate, but to confirm that the act had taken place. For modern minds, the thought is absurd, even grotesque, but for medieval families, it was a way to secure alliances and silence disputes. Without consummation, a marriage could be declared invalid, and without witnesses, consummation could be denied. In France and parts of Germany, there were records of the bizarre chivalry tradition. If a couple failed to consummate their marriage, neighbors would gather outside their home, banging pots and pans, mocking the groom, and jeering until he proved his virility. For women, the shame of being labeled unconsummated was immense. It reduced marriage to a public contest of fertility, stripping away privacy, dignity, and choice. Even more symbolic were the fertility rituals tied to weddings. In some rural communities, newlyweds were led to their bed by a crowd carrying torches, singing Bodhi songs, and blessing the couple with crude jokes about childbirth. It was, in tea, simply about humor. It was a way of binding the community to the couple-esque reproductive future. The private union of two individuals became a collective affair, where everyone had a stake in whether or not the marriage would produce heirs. And if we peel back the layers of ritual, we find an even darker superstition lurking underneath. Many believed that if the first act of intimacy was not properly done, it could curse the marriage. Miscarriages, infertility, and even bad harvests were blamed on brides who were thought to have lied about their virginity, or grooms who failed to perform. Sex itself became a ritual of cosmic consequence, a performance watched not just by families, but, in the medieval imagination, by God, the saints, and even demons waiting to exploit weakness. It is chilling to imagine how this shaped the psychology of marriage. Newlyweds stepped into their union under immense pressure, burdened by expectations that turned their bodies into symbols of honor and fertility. For women, the weight was crushing. They had to bleed. They had to be silent, and they had to endure the scrutiny of an entire community. For men, failure to perform could mark them as weak, impotent, or cursed. When we peel away the romanticized image of medieval weddings, what remains is a system of control disguised as ritual. These practices weren't about love or joy. They were about surveillance, proof, and power. But, as we'll soon uncover, the obsession with controlling marriage and virginity also led to extreme punishments and grotesque legal cases, where lives were destroyed in trials, annulments, and even executions, all in the name of purity. If the wedding night was a test, the courtroom became the battlefield where reputations, marriages, and even lives were decided. Medieval law courts often found themselves entangled in the murky business of virginity, consummation, and marital fraud. And the results could be horrifying. Let's start with an outline. If a man claimed his wife was not a virgin on their wedding night, he could petition the church for an annulment. But how could such a claim be proven? In many cases, the court demanded a physical examination. Imagine the humiliation. Women were forced to undergo invasive, degrading tests by midwives or matrons appointed by the court. These examinations weren't medical, they were symbolic, riddled with superstition. A woman might be declared impure based on the looseness of her body, the absence of a hymen, or even the opinions of gossiping neighbors. For many, a single accusation was enough to destroy a life. The horror didn't end there. Husbands who claimed they could not consummate their marriage sometimes underwent trials of their own. These were called impotence trials, and they were just as humiliating. Men were examined by physicians and forced to prove their virility. Some trials required men to attempt sexual intercourse in front of witnesses, an unimaginable ordeal, steeped in cruelty. If they failed, their wives could demand an annulment, branding them as weak and cursed. Then came the punishments for deception. A bride who is accused of lying about her virginity could be publicly shamed, flogged, or even executed in extreme cases. In certain regions, women who failed the proof of blood ritual were paraded through the streets with mocking songs and cruel symbols. Their families disgraced forever. The stain of dishonor was not just personal, it could taint entire bloodlines. One chilling story comes from the medieval French courts, where a young noblewoman was accused by her husband of not being a virgin. She was subjected to multiple humiliating examinations, with midwives prodding and gossiping over her body. In the end, The court sided with the husband. The marriage was annulled, her dowry confiscated, and she was sent back to her family in disgrace. No man of standing would marry her afterward, and she lived the rest of her life cloistered in poverty. And yet, these trials reveal something deeper. Virginity was not just a personal matter, but a legal weapon. Families used accusations of impurity to cancel alliances, reclaim dowries, or destroy political rivals. Virginity tests became tools of control, giving men and institutions the power to reduce women to mere contracts of flesh and blood. The cruelty of these practices wasn't limited to women, though they bore the brunt of it. Men, too, could be dragged into humiliating ordeals if their masculinity was questioned. Impotence trials often lasted for months, with physicians inspecting them repeatedly, neighbors gossiping, and priests weighing in. In one infamous case in 15th century France, a man was forced to prove his potency in front of witnesses by attempting intimacy with his wife under observation. He failed, surprisingly, and was branded impotent for life. His marriage was annulled, his reputation ruined, and his masculinity mocked endlessly. What these cases show is how medieval society weaponized intimacy. Virginity, purity, and consummation weren't just personal milestones, they were legal battlegrounds where lives could be dismantled with a single accusation. The courts of the Middle Ages turned bedrooms into crime scenes and intimacy into evidence. Behind the grim theatrics of virginity tests and trials lies an even darker truth. The church and state weren't just regulating marriage, they were using it to enforce control over bodies, reproduction, and honor. Every accusation, every annulment, every humiliation reinforced the idea that individuals didn't own their bodies. Instead, their bodies were property of family, church, and society. And yet there were cracks in this oppressive system. Some women fought back, using wit, cunning, or even forged evidence to defend their honor. But before we look at those rebellions, we must first uncover the sheer terror of punishments for failed purity. Punishments so cruel, they echo like nightmares across history. When accusations of impurity or marital deception escalated, the punishments could become shockingly brutal. In medieval society, purity wasn't just a personal virtue, it was currency, honor, and survival. Losing it, or even being accused of losing it, could mean public humiliation, torture, or even death. One of the most horrifying practices was the public shaming ritual. If a bride failed to prove her virginity after marriage, she could be paraded through the town in nothing but a thin shift, with mocking songs, blaring, her neighbors jeering, and her family shunned. Sometimes she was forced to carry symbols of her disgrace, a broken spindle, a bloodless bedsheet, or even a crude effigy of herself. For many, this spectacle was a social execution far worse than death itself. In harsher cases, punishments escalated to violence. In parts of Germany and Italy, accusations of deception in marriage contracts could lead to flogging or branding. A woman branded as impure often had no chance of redemption. Her future was sealed. There are chilling records of women being drowned, buried alive, or even stoned to death for accusations of premarital impurity, especially if family honor was at stake. Honor killings, though rarely recorded officially, were whispered about in chronicles, cloaked in silence but impossible to deny. And yet, men were not entirely safe. Husbands accused of impotence faced punishments that ruined their reputations. A man who failed to consummate his marriage could be mocked with humiliating rituals. In some regions, neighbors paraded him through the streets holding a wooden phallus or dressed in women's clothing, symbolizing his failure. These punishments struck at the very heart of medieval masculinity, branding him as less than a man. But the most sinister punishments were hidden within the walls of the church. For women accused of fornication or impurity, convents often became prisons. A disgraced woman might be forced into a nunnery against her will, locked away for life. In some cases, women were made to confess their sins publicly, before being sealed inside tiny anchorite cells, bricked up and left to live or die in isolation. The church presented these punishments as redemptive. But for the women trapped in them, they were nothing short of a living tomb. Despite this brutality, not all victims went quietly. Some women and families fought back with clever strategies to survive the horrors of virginity tests. In some towns, families secretly purchased animal blood to smear on sheets, faking the proof of virginity. Others bribed midwives or examiners to declare a girl intact. Regardless of the truth, in rare cases, women went to extreme lengths, using herbal concoctions to tighten the body, or even undergoing crude, dangerous surgical procedures to recreate the appearance of virginity. These acts were desperate, dangerous, and often deadly, but they reveal how far women would go to protect themselves from a system designed to crush them. There were also stories of women who turned the tables, using accusations as weapons. A clever woman might accuse her husband of impotence to escape an unhappy marriage, or exploit the virginity obsession to gain sympathy and protection. Some succeeded, but many more failed, falling into the pit of humiliation and punishment. And then there were the tragedy stories of young brides who, unable to face the horror of public shame, chose suicide over disgrace. Chronicles record grim tales of women throwing themselves from towers, drowning in rivers, or poisoning themselves the night before their wedding. These acts of despair serve as haunting reminders of the psychological torment that medieval purity culture inflicted. Ultimately, the horrific truth about medieval marriage and virginity tests is this: the system wasn't about love, trust, or intimacy. It was about control. Control of women's bodies, control of family honor, and control of reproduction. Virginity tests, punishments, and humiliations were not random cruelties, but carefully constructed tools of power. And that power left scars that echo even today. The obsession with purity, the policing of sexuality, and the fear of shame, these are legacies we still wrestle with centuries later. So, as we close this chapter of history, ask yourself, how much of our modern world still carries the shadows of these medieval practices, and how many lives were destroyed under the weight of a bloody sheet, a courtroom trial, or a single whispered accusation? This has been the horrific truth about medieval marriage and virginity. Tests a tale of fear, cruelty, and control, but also of resistance, cunning, and survival.